It's a great pleasure to introduce Kaija Gahm. She's a third-year PhD student in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology graduate program. And I will let her make the rest of the introduction herself and tell you about her work.
Okay, thank you. Now, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. So yeah, thank you for being here today. I'm going to talk about my work on developing a version of a method for randomizing animal movement paths in order to distinguish between social and spatial drivers of their social interactions. And I want to start by acknowledging and thanking my undergraduate mentee, Ryan, who was heavily involved in developing the simulation for this work and who has been really impressively picking up R very quickly and sort of learning how to integrate himself into my code and my project. So lots of thanks to Ryan. Okay, so animal social interactions are present across systems, across taxa. I have here a whole bunch of examples of social animals, including some wasps from the project of Emily, who I see is here in the audience, and some vultures, although not my study species, down in the bottom right-hand corner. And when we think about animal social interactions, we think about what factors might drive those interactions in terms of where they occur, when they occur, to what extent they occur. And the presence of spatial features on the landscape is, of course, one really important driver of social interactions. Spatial features like rivers, like mountain ranges, sources of food are really well known in the animal ecology literature to act as corridors or barriers or attractors for animal social interactions. So we can ask what determines animal social interactions, and two potential alternative hypotheses are that individuals interact with one another because they actually prefer to be together, which would be an example of social preference, or the not mutually exclusive other hypothesis, which is that spatial features push socially indifferent individuals to interact with one another, and that could be spatial constraints or spatial attractors. And of course, these two things could be acting at the same time, but they can be pretty hard to disentangle. Now, when we're analyzing social networks, such as those created by animals interacting socially, it can be hard to use traditional statistical methods because, by definition, the nodes and edges in a social network are not independent of each other, and therefore we often can't use parametric statistical tests. So usually we resort to reference models, which help us test hypotheses about social interactions and about individuals' position in the social network. And the way that that works generally is that we randomize the data, we permute either the individuals or the interactions or something about the movement paths, and then we compare a whole bunch of those randomizations to the observed values or measures from our observed social network. One type of randomization is that we can randomize the identities of nodes in the social network. And this is useful for testing hypotheses about characteristics of individuals in the population. This paper here that I'm citing, A Guide to Choosing and Implementing Reference Models for Social Network Analysis, lays out a scale describing reference models for social network analysis ranging on a continuum from models that are very, very similar to the empirical observations of sociality all the way to the more abstract models, which really go from the ground up and generate a social network from first principles. This type of randomization of node swapping is quite close to the observed social network and basically tries to permute the identities of nodes. And like I said, this type of randomization basically answers the question, what if a trait of interest were decoupled from an individual's social network measure? So for example, in this network, maybe the colors represent sex. What if sex were completely independent of these individuals, which would allow us to test questions about whether sex might influence the position of an individual in the social network. But when we have other types of questions, like the ones that I discussed earlier about what actually drives social interactions, space, social preference, factors of that nature, the question we're asking doesn't really have to do with characteristics of the individuals themselves. It really has more to do with the processes underlying what drives those social interactions. So one way to create a reference model that randomizes the trait of interest here is to randomize the actual segments of individuals' movement paths on the landscape, which breaks the spatiotemporal synchrony between the individuals that might be interacting. So over here on the left, I have a schematic of this. If we imagine that the pink colors represent time over a 5-day window, progressing from over here, the darkest colors at the beginning to the lightest colors at the end of the simulation, we see that these two individuals are moving together. They're moving through the landscape, interacting with each other periodically. They're in the same place at the same time. If we shuffle the segments of each individual's trajectory, we end up with individuals that still maintain their associations with their preferred areas of space. So they still go to the same places, but they do this at different times, and therefore they're decoupled from each other. So here we're decoupling, disrupting the process of interest, which is this spatiotemporal synchrony, and this allows us to disentangle whether the individuals are interacting due to preference or due to the use of space. This method was proposed by our collaborator, Ora Spiegel, in 2016 with this paper on sleepy lizards, where he did some simulations of computer simulated agents and then compared it to some real data from a population of sleepy lizards to test for sociality. And he proposed this exact type of randomization where you randomize the segments of movement paths in order to differentiate between social preference and spatial constraints. And indeed, he did find that for some of the sleepy lizards, there was a significant difference between social network measures in the observed lizard population, shown here in red, versus in the randomized movement track population, shown here in blue. So when you randomize those movement tracks, you create quote unquote interactions between those movement paths that have been randomized, and then you see whether the individuals that are observed are actually interacting more than would be expected by chance or by the spatially informed reference model. However, this introduces a bit of a problem, which we have been referring to as the teleportation problem. When you randomize segments of an individual's movement track, such as days, you might have an individual that goes to bed in one place and wakes up in another place, which is not biologically realistic. This is less of a problem for animals like the sleepy lizards because they're central place foragers. They pretty much return to the same burrow every night to sleep. But it's a much bigger problem for animals like our study system, the griffon vulture, which can often roost in very different places from day to day. So for example, over here, this vulture's trajectory shown in blue goes back to roost at the same roost location from one night to the next. But this individual here shown in red starts down here in the south and then ends up roosting much farther north just on the subsequent night. So you can imagine that if we randomize that individual's trajectories, it would be jumping all over the landscape in a way that really departs from biological realism. So in this research, we propose that instead of shuffling movement paths, the movement paths can be shifted either back or forth in time, independent of each other, and then wrapped around when they reach the end of the tracking period. So once again, we have our original observed movement paths with two individuals moving in synchrony. The shuffling method would randomly shuffle those day segments. The wrapping method would instead shift each segment forward or backward in time, independent of each other. And then once it reaches the end of the entire tracking period, it would loop around back to the beginning. So we can see this individual here starts with basically the day 3 color, goes along and then loops back to this darkest color. Its first day is looping around to the end. Here's another way of visualizing this. So we basically have these two alternative path randomization methods. If this is our observed data here with individuals shown in different colors, lettered from A to E, and days shown along the x-axis here, and the color changing as the days progress, the path shuffling method would randomly shuffle every individual's days in time, whereas the wraparound method would shift each individual's trajectory either backward or forward. This individual A is shifted forward by 1 day, causing the last day to loop around to the beginning. Individual B is shifted backward by 2 days, causing these first 2 days to jump to the end, and so on and so forth. And I've marked here these disjunctions where an individual would be quote unquote teleporting from one place to another between days. I've marked those with gray slashes. And as you can see, the wraparound method introduces many fewer of those disjunctions than the path shuffling method. So to evaluate this method, we created some computer simulations as following the methods described in the 2016 paper, and we asked a couple of questions about this method. First, we wanted to tell if the wraparound method does succeed in detecting social preference. So that's just like a baseline. Does this method work? Is it a good reference model to distinguish random interactions from interactions where individuals prefer each other? Then we asked whether the wraparound reference models were actually more similar, probably more biologically reasonable, to the observed interaction patterns than the path shuffling reference models were. And finally, we wanted to know whether the wraparound method would detect fewer false positives than the path shuffling method, and I'll get into a little bit more detail about what we mean by false positives later in this talk. So like I mentioned, we wrote a bunch of simulations. This is where my undergraduate mentee was extremely helpful. We simulated agents, fake animals, that were moving around a fake landscape. We had 3 scenarios. We had a scenario where an individual had basically a fixed home range represented by this black dot over here on the left. And then it would move around that home range every day without really changing its location in the landscape. We simulated a non-sociable and a sociable case for each of these things. So in the non-sociable case, every individual moved independent of every other individual. And in the sociable case, individuals could detect each other and could actually be attracted to the nearest other conspecific. So as you can see, these trajectories get a little bit closer to each other. The individuals merge their territories a little bit more. The second simulation that we detected, or that we created, was one where each individual's home range changed within a local area in a random direction every day. So the point that they were drawn to, the area they were moving around, would be different day to day instead of having that static home range with the black dot. And once again, we had a sociable and a non-sociable case. And then finally, we had a case of directional movement, and this might simulate a type of animal that's migrating or an animal that's trap-lining between resources, moving in a much more linear way. And once again, we had non-sociable and sociable cases. To measure social interactions, we paid attention to individuals' degree, which is the number of interaction partners that they have in a social network, as well as their strength, which is a measure of the total number of social interactions that they have with any social interaction partner. So basically the sum of the weights of all these edges in the social network. So to answer our first question, does the wraparound method detect social preference? We looked at the sociable agents in our simulation. And I'm going to show you for both degree and strength. On the x-axis, we're going to have the agents ranked by how social they were from most to least. And then on the y-axis, their degree, so the number of interaction partners they have from 0 up until 20 or so. Blue boxes are going to represent the wraparound method, and orange boxes are going to represent the path shuffling method. And these open circles represent the observed number of social interactions, the observed number of interaction partners that each individual had. So we see that for degree, we consistently saw that individuals were observed to have more interaction partners than the randomizations would predict. And these histograms demonstrate that in a slightly different way, where the dashed line is the population mean in the observed case. And then these histograms represent the population mean across all of the randomizations. We see the same thing for strength, same pattern, where this dashed line is quite far from both the orange and the blue curves. So we can say pretty confidently that yes, the wraparound method, just like the path shuffling method, does detect social preference. When we know that the individuals have actual preference for each other in our simulation, we do observe a difference between how social they are in the observed simulation versus the simulation that has been randomized, how it stays either shuffled or shifted. Movement paths can also be shuffled or shifted by different amounts. So in this wraparound method diagram, I showed that the paths could be moved forward, could be moved backward, but you could imagine either allowing them to shift over the entire randomization period, or restricting that shift, only allowing them to shift backward or forward by a very small amount. And so we ran our simulation and our randomization with varying degrees of range over which the trajectories were allowed to shift. And that's represented by these different blue lines here. The darkest blue lines allowed each individual's trajectory to only shift back and forward by 1 or 2 days in time, whereas the lightest blue lines allowed the trajectories to shift over the entire tracking period for the simulation. And this is an example from the sociable agents. And this is important because when we ask, are the wraparound reference models more similar to the observed interaction patterns than the path shuffling reference models are? So basically, have we created a more biologically reasonable and similar to reality reference model? The answer kind of varied by the time window that we used. So looking at our degree histograms, on the x-axis we have degree, and on the y-axis frequency. And once again, this is mean values across the population in all of the randomizations, those blue curves, versus the observed population mean degree for the in the dash, shown as the dashed line. We see that in all these cases with these sociable agents, as I showed before, the observed level of sociality differs significantly from what we see in the randomizations, which is good. It means our randomizations are succeeding. But we see that the extent to which it differs really varies based on this time window, and it also varies between the wraparound method and the path shuffling method. So indeed, we do see that at very low levels of shift, when we kept those trajectories really, really close to what they originally were and only shifted them by a little bit, we did succeed at generating a much more realistic reference model that was much closer to the observed values. This was also true for strength, where you can see these dark blue lines are much closer to the observed than the light blue lines, or than this orange line, which represents the path shuffling method. So once again, we can say, yes, our new method does generate a more realistic reference model than the path shuffling method did. There's a little bit of a problem, though, with both of these methods, and that is that the randomizations can sometimes detect social preference or avoidance when it doesn't exist. So I talked before about how we had non-sociable and sociable agents. The non-sociable agents were moving around completely indifferent to each other, and we know that for a fact because these are simulations. So we actually know that we programmed them to not care about each other, and any interactions, therefore, are just going to result as a chance result of them being in the same place at the same time. Whereas these sociable agents are drawn toward each other, and therefore their interactions are resulting from a combination of the space and their social attraction. So focusing only on the non-sociable agents here, where we know that the truth is that there's no underlying sociality, we could imagine a scenario where the observed value of degree or strength is significantly higher than the randomization values. And this would lead us to conclude that the individuals are displaying significant social preference, social attraction to each other, if we didn't know anything about the underlying data. If the opposite were true, and we saw that our observed result was significantly lower than the results returned by the randomizations, we would conclude that the individuals are significantly avoiding each other, right? They're displaying a significant signal of social avoidance. But if we observe either of these two scenarios, when we know that the underlying individuals are not sociable, we would know that this would be a false positive detection of either social preference or social avoidance. So we wondered whether the wraparound method detected fewer false positives than the path shuffling method. And indeed, we see that this is especially true in the case where the non-sociable agents were moving in a directional manner. So if you look at this orange line down here at the bottom, you can see that the orange line, the path shuffling method, differs very significantly from the observed degree and the observed strength in the simulation. And the wraparound method does also detect these false positives when it is when the paths are allowed to shift over large time ranges. But when we reduce that potential time range for these darker blue lines, and we only allow trajectories to shift backward or forward by a smaller amount, we actually successfully detect no difference between the observed and the randomized values of degree and strength. If you look at the top row here, where the individuals have static home ranges, you can see that all the simulations are correctly detecting no difference between observed and expected values, because these are non-sociable agents. And then down here, we do see these false positives, but we see that the wraparound method has less of those false positives and is able to mitigate that with its smaller time window. There's another interesting thing going on up here, which is that we have a false detection of social avoidance for the path shuffling method. This orange curve is significantly to the right of the dashed line. So we're concluding that individuals are avoiding each other when in fact we know that they're not avoiding each other because we know that they're socially indifferent. So we wondered for a while what was going on here, and we concluded that in this simulation, individuals are sharing space significantly. They're really all reaching the same areas of space. They're overlapping with each other's territories a lot during the course of the simulation. And because of that sharing of space, what's causing individuals to not interact is really just a temporal separation rather than a spatial separation. Whereas in both of these other scenarios, here we have individuals with pretty defined territories that are separated from each other, maybe in time, but also in space. And down here, we have individuals whose paths are diverging and who, again, are separated from each other in space quite considerably. So in this particular case where individuals share a lot of habitat, which is a biologically relevant case, it's true for our study system, it's going to be true for a lot of study systems, we see that the path shuffling method, by randomizing the days amongst each other, basically causes individuals to bump into each other when they would not otherwise have bumped into each other. Whereas the shifting method, the wraparound method, reduces this problem by quite a bit and really allows those trajectories to be shifted relative to each other and therefore not to bump into each other in such a brief way. The same thing doesn't happen for strength because degree, unlike strength, is very sensitive to brief interactions, whereas strength really considers the sum total of all an individual's interactions over the entire simulation. So in summary, we do see that the wraparound method detects fewer false positives than the path shuffling method. It's not perfect, especially when individuals are moving directionally, but it is pretty good and it avoids this problem that the path shuffling method has. Finally, we used a brief case study where we applied data from free-ranging griffon vultures, and we used these methods on those birds. Here are some vulture trajectories on the right compared to our simulated trajectories on the left. They fall qualitatively. They're kind of similar to either the static home range scenario or the locally changing home range scenario. And on the right here, we examined both degree and strength for our vultures, and we saw that the observed values for the vultures were significantly different for both degree and strength. So we detected significant signals of sociality. And you can see that the orange boxes down here are so small that they're almost not possible to see. This is the path shuffling method. So the path shuffling method detects a huge difference between observed and randomized social network measures. And these blue boxes represent not only the wraparound method, but the wraparound method with an extremely restricted amount of shifting allowed. So each individual's trajectory was only allowed to shift forward or backward by 1 day. And even that was enough to decouple the temporal synchrony of individuals' movements from each other, enough to detect a social preference in this species. Now, this is important because these vultures are known to be social, and so using this case study as sort of a sanity check for us to make sure that our method returns the expected biological results, this was really reassuring that we did detect social preference in these vultures. There is a bit of a caveat, which is that griffon vultures' movements are significantly shaped by the appearance and location of ephemeral carcasses on the landscape, shown at the bottom here. These are their important food source. And so a future direction that I would like to take this method is to try to develop a reference model that can cope with ephemeral resources on the landscape. So basically what happens when the landscape is changing so rapidly that putting an individual onto that landscape on a different day may actually have very different results for their sociality. So in conclusion, we found that randomizing movement trajectories using our new wraparound method created more biologically plausible reference models that still do succeed in detecting social preference where it exists. We also found that the wraparound method reduced false positive detections of social preference or avoidance, and that was especially true when animals shifted their home range. So this is really important when we're considering how to use reference models to study the social interactions of animals who don't have a fixed territory, who might be moving over the landscape, migrating, moving in a way that isn't as simple as just foraging, returning to the same burrow every single night. Both methods do confirm existing natural history knowledge of sociality in free-living vultures, and they raise a bunch of other questions for future study in the vulture system. And we're really encouraged by these results. We think that this is an exciting new reference model that will enable researchers to find out more about how to distinguish social preference from the influence of spatial features on animals' sociality. So some future directions with this model in particular, we'd like to examine different levels of sociality. So what if individuals are really, really attracted to conspecifics, or what if they're just weakly attracted to conspecifics? We didn't test that, so it would be a nice thing to explore. We'd also like to explore a little bit more about varying time windows, both in the path shuffling and in the wraparound method, and comparing those directly together. This is work that our collaborator had previously done, and we'd like to bring that into a discussion with our work currently. And then finally, it would be really interesting to investigate the robustness of this method to missing data, to data that is inconsistently missing, because as we all know, animal tracking data is not always perfectly complete. And it would be great to figure out if this method holds up really well when you're missing entire segments of data for different individuals. So finally, I'd like to acknowledge my funding sources, the NSF, UCLA, the Israel Nature and Parks Authority, as well as my co-authors, Ryan, my two advisors, Noah and Or, well, my advisor Noah, my co-author Or, and then Nili, Gideon, and Marta, who are members of Or's lab and have been instrumental for their work on the Vulture project, as well as the rest of the Pinter-Wollman lab and the INPA rangers who make the Vulture work possible. And finally, thank you all for being here. I'll take any questions.